Group. Glad you could join us for our session with Jim Donahoe presenting Linux fundamentals for a SQL DBA. I will say I'm Linux challenged, so I'm really excited for today's presentation. We'll be having Q&A throughout the presentation, and I will be asking the questions that pop up in the chat as they go along. Just to note, this session will be recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube in the next few days. And with that, I'll let you take it away, Jim.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So good. I guess it's evening for you folks. It's evening for me. My name is Jim Donahoe. Let me go back to the session. Sorry. So the session name is it's in flux, right? I say Linux fundamentals for the SQL DBA or SQL Server on Linux for the Windows DBA. No matter what the title is going to be tonight, is we're going to put SQL Server on Linux. Tonight we're going to interact with it. I'm going to teach you some of the basic concepts with Linux, how to interact with your databases, some of the similarities, some of the things that don't work. But first, a little bit about me. Again, my name's Jim Donahoe. I am a DBA by trade, which means I don't consider that as a database admin. I consider it means I do about anything. I'm a huge cloudy, obviously. I always enjoyed working in the cloud. I formerly worked at Microsoft. I worked at Microsoft for almost 5 years. Unfortunately, I was laid off in July. However, I still have plenty of friends there. I still contribute to some projects, including the Linux project. I do a lot of work with that. I'm a huge video game nerd. I collect a lot of video games. I should change this to not so big data anymore because I was working with some pretty big data for a bit. Obviously, I was an Azure enthusiast. I don't know a lot about AWS. I know some, and I'll talk about that when we start talking more about the Linux things here in a bit. My contact info is there. I help run the local Pittsburgh SQL Server user group when we actually have meetings. Right now, we're kind of on a hiatus, but my email's there, my Twitter's there. Best thing for you to probably do is use me on email because Twitter is pretty much dead for me. But enough about me, though. Let's talk about this. So why should we put SQL Server on Linux, right? It works so well on Windows. What the hell do we want to put it on Linux for, right? Well, when I was at Microsoft, I asked the same questions. Like, what was the point of doing this? And Bob Ward, if you're familiar who Bob Ward is, he pointed me to his book, right? His book is a very good guide on how to get started with Linux and why Microsoft did it. But some of the key points were, Linux has been growing in the market share around the tech world, right? It's been around forever, but it's been growing more and more in the market share lately. It's a popular platform for a lot of purposes. The other big reason, clients were asking for a Linux offering for SQL Server, right? When Microsoft likes to do, well, they like to try to do what clients want because it's going to give them money. Linux is a wide adoption in DevOps, and part of that is due to containers, right? So I'm sure most of you have probably heard of containers like Docker or Kubernetes, right? Everybody's probably heard those big buzzwords. Well, Docker containers primarily use the Linux kernel, and that's one of the main reasons why they're popular. They're very lightweight, and unlike virtual machines, they don't need to emulate an entire hardware stack to operate. So if I want to spin up a Docker container, I don't have to have a whole Windows license available with storage and all those things. It's a lot easier to spin up a container running Linux. Linux is very popular in big data spaces, such as well, like Hadoop, Cloudera, and Hortonworks. In the cloud itself, Linux is the popular operating platform of choice, right? So a lot of Microsoft services are running on a Linux backend. Even in AWS, they run a lot of their things on a Linux backend. So some more reasons, customers they're happy with SQL Server, but they want more options, right? It's kind of like your car. Usually when you go out to buy a new car these days, what are standard options now were considered, luxury options before. I know when we bought our new car, it came with power seats, power windows, a heated seat. And I was like, man, how much is that going to cost? Like, oh, this is just basic. And I'm sitting and looking at my 15-year-old car. I'm like, I had to pay extra for power windows. Like, what the hell? So now I have a fancy car, but Same thing with SQL Server on Windows. Everybody's like, oh, well, I want more things to do. I want to be able to run it on Linux because I want to use Linux. It gives you a choice of platform in the cloud. You get your choice of development languages that interact with SQL Server, right? And their big thing is you want to lower your total cost of ownership, right? Because Windows licenses are expensive, right? A Windows license for a server, depending on how many connections and all that good stuff, I swear, with Windows licensing and SQL Server licensing, it's more complicated than taxes. So don't ask me licensing questions. I can tell you that it's cheaper with Linux. Um, Customers also looking for more open source software, right? Linux, open source. You can do what you want. Um, Customers are asking for multiple support languages like Node.js, PHP, Python, Ruby, a lot of others, right? Those are all available within the Linux stack, right? So those are the reasons why they want to put SQL Server on Linux. Let's talk about some pre-installation considerations, though, that you need to know before you go out and say, I'm going to put SQL Server on Linux, okay? These are the current supported versions. So for Red Hat, it's 8x through 9x. For SUSE, it's V15, Service Pack 1 through Service Pack 4 only. For Ubuntu, it's version 20.04 through 22.04. And for the Docker engine, it's version 1.8 or higher. Right now, this is for SQL Server 2022. Right, so anything I'm showing you for supported versions or features that aren't available, these are for SQL Server 2022. Right, if you're not on 2022 yet, don't worry about it. But I always try to use the latest and greatest. Odds are most of you probably aren't on 2022. The versions, though, the supported Linux versions are all going to be the same process, though. So SQL on Linux came out with SQL Server 2016. They want you to be on the latest versions of OS. So they're going to tell you if you ever had to open up a ticket, they're going to want you to be on one of these versions. Just like with SQL Server on Windows, your CPU is important, right? Your CPU frequency governor that you want to set that to performance, right? The high clock performance, no power save mode. This is kind of like when you're in Windows, you want to put your machine in high performance mode so that the CPU doesn't idle down. You know, you always want that CPU ramped up, ready to run. Same thing, same premise with Linux. You want your energy performance bias set to performance. Same idea. Minimum performance percentage set to 100. And then the C states, or you're going to set the C1. If you don't know what those are, that's okay. Your Linux, if you don't have, if you do decide to do a Linux install, odds are you're going to have a Linux admin, and you can tell them this if they don't already know it. Most of them will probably already know it. Numa, I love me some Numa stuff. For Numa, you want to consider it as well for your Linux servers. This is a kernel setting, though. This is not an app setting. So in Linux, you have the kernel, right? The Linux kernel is like the brain. And you can't see the kernel of Windows, but when the kernel of Windows gets mad, that's when you get that nice blue screen error, right? Well, with Linux, you make the kernel mad, it just kind of sits there and looks at you like, okay, you broke me, now you got to fix me, right? It's not like Windows when you just reboot and fixes it. With Linux, if you break the kernel, you got to try to back out what you did. But if you're not familiar with Numa, that automatically balances the moves and tasks closer to the memory that they're accessing if you have it split across nodes. These are things you got to consider again with your SQL Server on Linux. Same ideas what you do on Windows. The disk read ahead, though, with Linux, you want to set that to 4096, right? This is when you're going to load your contents into the cache, right? Because everybody wants to be able to read fast. So set your read aheads to 4096, right? These are all Microsoft standards, right? So these are nothing like I'm just pulling out of my head. If you would call Microsoft support and say, hey, I need the best practices, they're going to say, yeah, 4096 for your read aheads. For your virtual address space, with Linux, each process from the OS runs in its own memory sandbox or the space. The virtual address space default is 65,536 bytes, right? That's not high enough, especially not for nowhere near for a production box, right? Set that to be at least 256K. Swap file. Everybody knows what a Windows page file is, right? If you don't, look them up. But the swap file is the same thing as a paging file. You want to set it properly. If you're not familiar with what you should set to, contact your Linux admin. They'll let you know. But essentially, you want to make sure your swap file is big enough to fit your SQL Server's data. It doesn't have to be that big. It depends on who you talk to, but you want a sizable swap file for your SQL Server. Dynamic memory on Linux VMs. Yep, do not use it. It's not there. Right. So these are things that are unsupported with Linux with SQL Server on Linux. Merge. Thank you. When I saw that wasn't supported, I kissed my keyboard, because if you've never worked with merge, consider yourself lucky. If you've worked with merge and you see this, you're probably going to say, you know what, I want to switch to Linux right now because I'll never have to touch it again. Stretch DB, that's a deprecated feature anyway. Link servers to data sources other than SQL Server. So you can't link to an Oracle server or anything like that. Buffer pool extensions, they're not supported. With your agent, so the subsystems calls for like command exec, PowerShell, that kind of stuff, those aren't there. SSIS, SSAS, SSRS, they're not available on Linux. Mirroring is not available with SQL on Linux. I'm sorry if you're still using mirroring. And if you are using mirroring, we got to have a different conversation, because you shouldn't be using it anymore. You can't do AD auth. Obviously, it's Linux. There's no, you can't, it's not Active Directory joined. You can do Kerberos, but there's a whole thing around it. So yeah, now this is the stuff for 2019, but all of these things it's the same for 2022. I don't know of any of these that are going to be put for future builds, but I doubt it, because some of these just can't be done in Linux because it's not feasible. So let's talk about how to install it, right? Because the installation is a lot different than what you're used to on Windows. So the first step you do is you got to import your public repo keys, and then you got to configure your source repo, right? And we're going to go through all this when I start showing you demos on things. Once you have the repos built, you want to update the cached repo. You want to make sure that it's up to date with the most updated release of the installer of the files, right? Once you do all that, then you install SQL Server, okay? Then you run it, then you have to run the setup, right? So, with Windows, you install and set up at the same time. With Linux, you install first, then you run a setup. And then optionally, if you want to install some SQL Server tools, which we're going to do. One of the big things you set up after SQL Server is done is there's this thing called no A time, right? By default, Linux will track when files were last accessed. Why would this be bad for a database? And I'm asking you guys. So somebody chime in as why it would be bad for any time a file is accessed.
Because it's doing it continuously.
Yeah, continuously on your server, right? So you want to turn this off because you don't want Linux keeping track of every time your database is accessed, because you're going to get a lot of overhead, right? So I give you the options to do that here, right? So these are the commands you would run. Sudo means super user do. We'll talk more about that one here in a little bit. Just chatter -R plus A, and you give it the data directory, right? And then you want to confirm it when you want to set. You run this command down here, and it should come back true. Another thing we want to do, just like in Windows, you gotta limit SQL Server's memory use, right? Because we all know SQL Server's a pig, and it will eat all the memory it can, right? You got to do it a little differently with Linux, though, because by default, Linux will only allow the SQL Server process to use 80% of the physical RAM, and that's it. Well, on large servers, that's a lot of unused memory, right? So if your server has like 2 terabytes of memory, 20% of that is what? It's a big number. It's enough to make my director say, like, what are we paying for all this memory for if we can't use it? Smaller servers doesn't leave you enough, right? So you got to configure an appropriate amount, and I'll show you the commands on how to do that, right? And now you're gonna be the only ones that know how much memory you should use, but everybody here knows like the best practices on what you should use for memory for the same things. One thing Linux has that Windows doesn't is called the killer. Stands for out of memory, right? So when there's enough memory pressure on a Linux system, the kernel is going to choose a process to be killed to restore the smooth operation of the system. Since SQL Server will usually have the largest memory footprint, it puts a big target on its back. Remember, there's also no locked pages in memory functionality currently available in Linux. Currently available. I don't know if that's going to be something they're working on or not, but right now it's not there. So if SQL Server gets targeted for this out of memory, for killer, it's bad, right? Your whole process crashes. So this is where you got to balance your comfortable limit. Some Linux basics here, right? If you're not familiar with Linux, it's all command line. Some basic Linux navigation stuff, cat. This will list your file contents in a catalog. mkdir, make dir creates a new directory. rmdir or roomdir will remove an empty directory. If you type in pwd, this gives you the present working directory, or I like to say is where the heck am I, right? Because it's Linux, and there's really not like a Windows file explorer where I can click it and say, oh, I'm this far down. So no, you got to type in pwd to see where you're at. MV for moving files, CP for copying files, RM for removing files and directories, LS for listing directory contents, right? Sudo, execute commands as a super user. This is kind of like running as an admin, right? So if you have admin rights, cool. If you don't, you're not gonna be able to run sudo. So file and folder permissions. Linux lists these a little differently than everybody. So if you look here, the D here will stand for the directory. So for the directory, the owner has read, write, and execute. That first the first block here is read, write is the owner. The second block where we'll see R-X is for a group. And then the last block, the R-X is for everyone, right? So it's a little confusing because it doesn't break it out the way, I would like it. It doesn't say like owner has this, group has this. It's just kind of all jumbled together. But here is the owner of this directory. It's MSSQL, right? If you need to change permissions, the command is chmod. If you want to change ownership of a directory, it's chown. We're going to talk more about these two here, just in a little bit. Root. Everybody in IT has probably heard of a root user, right? Every Linux server has an admin account named root. You do not want to log in and run commands as root. Instead, you want to use sudo or super user do. An example for this would be restarting your SQL Server service. You can see the command down here in the bottom. It's that sudo systemctl restart MSSQL server, right? If you're logged in as root, you wouldn't need the sudo part. You would just run this part, but you really shouldn't log in as root. You should log in as an account that can have this permission. Another thing that Linux is going to have that you don't see on Windows is it has its own service account. It's MSSQL. During the install, the MSSQL user and group are created. The SQL Server processes must run under this account. I'm going to say this again. The SQL Server processes must run under this account. You cannot change this. You cannot create a different account and run them under. It has to be under this account or SQL Server will not work. All SQL Server related files must be owned by the MSSQL user and group. Again, they have to be owned by them. If they're not, it won't work. If anything happens where the ownership gets switched, let's say you don't believe me and you start the service up under your personal username. When you do that, all the files will get switched ownership to you. And then you're going to be wondering why SQL Server doesn't work. You're going to have to restart the service and then change the ownership using this bottom command. I can't tell you how many times I had folks when I was working at other places calling and saying, my Linux environment's not working. We restarted. I tried to start the service up. I'm like, okay, who'd you start the service up under? Myself. It's like, well, you can't do that. You got to start it up under this. You got to do this. So please take my advice. Please don't try to break it. Don't try to prove me wrong because it's not going to work. You got to run it under MS SQL and they have to retain permissions. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Here's some of the file system structure for Linux, right? Just the slash, that's the root of the drive, equivalent to going to like C:\\/ on your Windows drive. /bin is where your system binaries are stored. /dev is devices. /etc, this will host specific system-wide configuration files. Your /home/username, that's your user's directory. So it's kind of like your user, your home user account for your Windows machine. /opt is for optional software packages like SQL Server. /var, this is files with frequently varying content, like our data and log files. We're going to interact with a lot of these when I get to the demos. Where am I going to be able to find my SQL Server files in? Well, your SQL Server logs are going to be stored under the var opt MS SQL log. This will contain all your error logs, your agent logs, and any default trace files you have running. Your configuration file is something you'll probably interact with pretty often when you're first setting up your Linux server. This is stored under var opt MS SQL and mssql.conf. This is where your master key is stored if you need access to that. All the binaries for SQL Server are stored here. By default, this is where your data transaction logs and your backup files are stored. In our demos, I'm going to show you how we switch these. Some useful monitoring commands, though. Let's say you're trying to troubleshoot some stuff going on in your Linux server. There's no task manager with Linux, right? So you can't really hurry up and see like what's going on. These things can help out. We have df, which will show you the disk usage of the file system. dstat will show you system stats. Free will just show you free and used memory. I am a big user of htop. Htop is an interactive process viewer. So this is kind of what I would use for a Linux taskman. IOstat gives you CPU and IO statistics. MPstat is cool if you want to see your processor-related stats. PIDstat gives you statistics for tasks. And then if any of these, you can use the man command. Like if you want to do man PIDstat, it'll give you help on syntax and options. So if you just type in PIDstat, it's just going to give you the default view. But there's plenty of other ways you can look at it. So if you just do man PIDstat, it'll give you a whole list of ways you can run it. All right. So that's all the slides I have. So I'm going to get ready to show you the good stuff. Is everybody still doing okay?
Yep.
Anybody have any questions?
I haven't seen any come through yet.
Nope, not yet.
All right. Okay. So right now I have a SQL Server set up on a VM sitting next to me. So let's get into it. 1, 2, 6, 8. Yeah, I gotta remember the IP address. Give me 1 second. 15. All right. So if you're not familiar with what I'm using, if you're using Windows 11, Windows 11 has this lovely new tool called Terminal. And inside Terminal, you can install the WSL for the Windows subsystem of Linux, or I think whatever the actual term means. But you can actually install Linux in a small container on Windows now. So that's what I'm using. I'm using SSH to connect to my VM. right? So right now, this is my SQL. This is the box I'm going to install SQL Server on. So the first thing we got to do is, we remember that little walkthrough I gave you, is we got to go out and get to the repo and pull down the latest info, right? So I'm going to copy and paste these commands in. I'm going to send Christina this Linux workbook I have for you guys. It's a Word document that walks you through installing. It's going to walk you through every single demo I'm showing you here, plus some. So if you guys have time later, if you want to mess around with it and you have questions on it, feel free to shoot me an email. But I put this together so that people can, mess around with Linux and get a feel for it.
You're so awesome.
So you see how I put, go ahead.
So you're so awesome. I love it. I have like a step-by-step guide later I can do.
So you see how it's asking me for my my sudo password for my username, right? So let me type it in, right? So when I did that, the command should auto-complete, right? So now it did that. So the next thing I got to do is I got to make sure these are up to date, right? So you can see here, I'm going out to packages.microsoft.com. I'm using Ubuntu. The version I'm running is 2204. I'm grabbing the latest SQL Server 2022 list, and it's going to make sure everything's right. So, okay. Now, the next thing I got to do is like, all right, so my repos are there. They're updated. I got them local. Let's make sure everything's up to date. So I'm going to run this sudo apt get update. And we're going to start seeing Linux say, okay, everything's getting red. You're going to give me problems here. Let's see what happens. Let's see if we can install. Okay, no. Give me a second. It did this to me before. It's going to make me troubleshoot on the fly with you guys. Try this again. Sorry, folks. Just give me a minute. I gotta go back through my notes as to how I fixed this the last time, because I was talking with Christine about this before, about how it worked fine. I knew it was going to do this.
You're fine. You're fine. I do have a question that says, are there different editions like standard or express?
There are, and we're gonna see that once I get the installer to run. You'll get the option to say like what version you want to install. There we go. 204. Let's try this again. Yep. Write that. Clear this. Let's kind of see what we're doing. All right. Now. Okay. That's what the problem is. It doesn't have the pub key. All right, so let's try this again. So since it didn't have a public key available, we got to make sure we give it that. This should make it work, I hope. If not, I'm going to be out of ideas and we might have to blow this VM away and just kind of talk through it. Okay, that works. So now, by giving it this public key, and this is, I'll have to add it into the workbook, but by giving it access to this public key, it's like, okay, this is signed. Now we're good, right? So now it's going to now let me update the package. So now we should be able to install SQL Server. So let me clear this again. definitely not what I wanted. All right. So SQL Server is now installing, right? Now you're, like I said, somebody asked about, choosing your version, right? Well, if you notice, I did not choose a version yet. I just said install SQL Server. We're going to choose our version here once SQL Server installs, because remember, we install SQL Server first, and then we set it up. So hopefully it doesn't take too long. It's thinking about it. Okay, there we go. So SQL Server is installed, and you can see here it tells you, please run this to complete your setup, right? So you can actually just copy this, right? Paste that in. Now, see, now we got to enter our edition, right? So evaluation, developer, express, web. I don't even think web's available anymore, but it's there. Standard, enterprise. These are all the paid versions, so you got to watch. These are new options here, so you can, if you want to pay, if you have an Azure subscription, you want to pay for your license through there, you can do pay as you go billing through that way. For our purposes, I'm going to choose 2 for developer, right? Because that's free, and free is for me. Do I accept the license terms? Absolutely. So now this is your SA password, right? So notice you can't see what I'm typing. This program requires a machine with at least 2,000. What? You don't have enough memory? What are you talking about? Hang on a second. All right. Let's do this real quick. I have other virtual machines running, and they should not be running, and that's what's going on.
I mean, I'm not allowed to have 100 tabs up at once.
Well, it's a small desktop that's
I'm just kidding.
doing all this, and it really doesn't like sharing all this. So hopefully this fixes it. Because, like I said, of course, this is what it does to me when we're doing this, because it wasn't giving me this problem before today. And I swear I tested all my demos. I was like, good, we're good. How did I know it was going to do this? All right. So I just restarted it. Just give me a second to get it logged back in. And then, all right. Still on 15. Okay. Okay. Let's see if we can run setup now. 2. There we go. Let me zoom this back in for you folks. So now it's configuring my SQL Server. You guys able to see this again? All right. So SQL Server says it's done. So it's now started, right? Well, it's starting. So let's make sure it actually started. The command we run for this is this system control status MS SQL Server, right? And there it is. So everything from here down is what we just ran. So you can see the Microsoft SQL Server database engine. It's enabled, it's preset. It's been running for 24 seconds. This is its main processor ID. So we know it's running. That's great. Now, what do I do with it? Right? Well, to prove to you it's actually there, let's connect to it. Oh, you know what? We're not going to be able to connect to it yet. We got to do a few more things yet. So SQL Server's there. But now to interact with it, we got to do a few other things. So the first thing we got to do, we're going to install some of the SQL CLI tools, which we're going to do through this. Again, we're going to reach out to our packages to get a new repo for the tools. Okay. Repos are set. So now we got to update our repo, make sure everything's up to date. That's good. All right. Now we're going to do an install of the MS SQL tools, right? So again, sudo apt-get. Apt-get is just a way of installing things, or it's a fetch program for Linux. We're going to install MS SQL Tools 18 for Unix ODBC-dev. Do we want to continue? Make sure you do a capital Y, otherwise it gets really mad. This is one of the only few installs I've ever seen that actually gives you like this kind of interface to install. I was actually pretty impressed that it did it. I thought I broke it the first time. So I'm going to choose the yes to accept the license terms. Again, yes. So yeah, so now the tools are installed. The next thing I want to do is I want to open up the firewall access to 1433, right? So you can see super user do, UFW, allow in 1433. You'll get this nice little comment, rules updated. So now, if I come up here, 8, 68, 15, 1433. So one thing with Linux you probably noticed already is that you couldn't name your instance, right? You cannot have a named instance in SQL Server on Linux, unfortunately. You can only have, so it's one instance per server. That's one of the things that stinks, but that's the way it is. I don't know if you guys can see this really well. I don't have Zoom it, but up here next to the database icon, there's a little penguin sitting next to it. So you know you're sitting on a Linux box, right? Notice I had to put the 1433 at the end. If I don't put that there, I won't get in, right? So just to prove to you, just, why not? It's just going to sit there and fail. So we can use SSMS, but I'm also going to use the GUI just to show you guys some cool stuff through the GUI, or not through the GUI, through the command line. Already did that fail. Cancel out of that. All right, so let me clear this screen. I want to install 2 more tools real quick because they don't come out of the box installed. So remember, these are a few of those tools that dstat we're going to install. And then we're going to install htop. Okay, so clear that. So let's connect to our instance here. And probably, if you've ever had to connect to the DAC port for SQL Server, if you ever had like an emergency and you had to connect in this way, you probably recognize SQL CMD, right? Same thing on Linux. Capital S for the server. We're just going to do localhost. Capital U for the username. We're going to use SA. If I wanted to put the password in, I can do --P, but I don't want you guys to see my password. Oh, really? It's going to tell me that? I did install the tools, didn't I? Okay. Oh, I know why. I know why. It helps if you go to the directory first. Let's try that again. Really. Oh, it's really trying me today. I didn't make my reach directory. Here we go.
You have to change executable.
I figured it. I forgot to put one of my commands in to be able to globally launch, right? So it's one of the, what is that? Oh, my goodness, why is it giving me all these problems?
Because you're doing it live.
It's exactly it. Again,
It's
if I
guaranteed.
ODBC driver error for SQL Server SSL verify. Oh my goodness. All right. So let's just, all right. We'll do this the easier way. The tried and true method, right? Management Studio. So we're going to create a user first, right? Login user 1, password 1, obviously really good password here. Running under master, so now we have that there, right? One of the things you'll notice now is that even though Linux is running, the agent's not running, right? The agent has an X. That's because by default, the agent's disabled with SQL Server on Linux. Just the same way as on Windows, but it's a little bit more complex to enable it on Linux, right? So I was talking to you about it in the slides, that MS-SQL conf file, right? So let's look at that. So we're going to do the sudo and cat for catalog, and we're going to look at the conf file itself. If you look here, there's some options already in here, right? SQL agent enabled, false. Licensing, we're not doing Azure billing, and we accepted the end user license agreement, right? Cool. I want to change this though, because I want to be able to use my agent. So we're going to run this command. That's not the command. My copy and paste skills. There we go. So we're just going to say set SQL agent dot enabled to true, right? And it's going to tell you same thing it does on Windows. Anytime you're going to make a change, you got to restart, right? Okay. Well, I don't have to restart to see the change itself. So if I cat that file again, we can see it is now set to true, right? Well, let's go ahead and restart it. So that this way, we can show the agents running. So you gotta wait for it to restart. So if I start refreshing here we go. So now my agent is green. So that's enabling the agent. That was pretty simple, right? A little bit different than what you're used to, but all right. So another common thing folks want to do on Linux is they don't want to use the default locations for where it stores the databases, right? Nobody does, right? Anybody running a production database anywhere, OCD or not, they're not going to leave all their databases, all the transaction logs, all the log files in one big folder, right? We don't do that. We always make separate folders for everything. So that's what we're going to do here. So I'm going to start making directories here. So sudo make dir MS-SQL. Again, remember, put it under these folders. And we're going to make a transaction logs folder, right? And then I want to make a backups folder. Let's see here. All right. So there we go. We see backups and we see T logs, right? What? one of the things that we got a problem with is, you see how they both say root owns these folders? That's bad, right? SQL Server won't be able to use them unless I switch it to this. Remember, because I told you, if it doesn't have it, if it's not owned by that MS SQL user and group, you're not going to be able to use it with SQL Server, right? So we're going to run our command, chown MS SQL. This is for the tlogs folder. And then we're going to run it again for backups. And I'm going to tempt fate here by typing live. There we go. So now if I check these again, now these are all owned by the correct user. So the next thing I want to do is I want to update my comp file, right? I want to do set file location for the default log directory to that transaction log folder I just made. So we're going to run that command. And again, it tells you, well, you got to restart to do for it to take effect, and that's okay. The next thing I want to do, I want to run a similar command, but I want to set it for the backup directory, right? So again, it's going to say restart. And just before we restart it, we should be able to see, right? There we go. So once I restart the service, these will be the default locations for those files. So let's go ahead and restart. All right. Let's to make sure this actually works, let's go ahead and create a database next, right? Because you could just take my word for it that it's going to work, but my word isn't what it is lately because it's been really weird. It's not letting me do the things I want it to do. All right, I don't know if it's going to let us do this through Management Studio, but let's create this database, my second database. And let's see if it'll let me back it up this way. Okay, did. All right. Now, if I look in my logs folder, I should see there it is. There's my log directory. I know it says tlogs, but just for this purposes, I'm just going to leave it that way. For my backup, I should see something in there. There it is. My backup is there. So that's cool. Everything's working the way it's supposed to, right? Any questions? No.
Nope, we just had some comments
That's
a while back. Cindy had said biggest issue she had to deal with is the apps that are on Linux trying to connect to SQL on Windows. And then Mark said it's AI infiltrating.
Rob Labbit, or Mark Labbit, yeah, Mark. It's exactly what it is. It's honestly, I think what it is. It's more of it's the 2022 binaries on the version of Ubuntu I'm running. Probably, it's probably a little cranky with what we're doing, but who knows? It's gonna bother me though, so I'm gonna probably mess with it later to make sure I have it working right. But yeah, it could be AI because we were talking about it before on the call so much. The machines are listening. All right, so let's start working with the memory and let's say you want to change your TCP port, right? Because everybody knows SQL Server runs on 1433 by default. Well, if we want to change it, well, I'll show you how to do that. The first thing, let's do free, right? So here's what we have for memory. So this is our swap file, right? So we're not even using our swap file yet, which is good. Here's our memory. The total amount of memory this server has is 4 gig. It's using about 1. So let's set this to 3 gig, right? Again, restart to make sure it's happy. You probably thought that by installing it on Linux, you wouldn't have to restart stuff so much. Haha, fooled you. It's still a Microsoft product. Memory limit, MB. So we're good, right? Let's talk about the TCP port now, right? So again, if you don't want it to run on 1433, we have this command here. Set your network.tcp port to 5432, right? Again, restart me to make this work. Copy. Oh, come on. Restarting that. The next thing I got to do is I got to make sure. Remember, we changed that firewall to allow in 1433. Well, I got to set it to allow 5432. So I do that now. So I don't know if I'll lose my connection or not, being that I'm already connected on this one. It might. Looks like it is. Okay, so this is good. So right now we're trying to connect on 1433, which we know we just changed, right? So once it's done being angry with me, let's change this to 5432. And there we are. We're back in, right? There's our database. Now, if I would try it the old way with the 1433, it should fail, right? Because we just updated the conf file to say I don't want to use 1433. I want to use 5432. There we go. Let's say you're happy using 1433 though, and you don't want to have to use a specific port, and you already ran through my demos and you want to back that out. No problem. This is the way you back that out. You unset the network TCP port. Right? Again, it's going to need restarted. By doing this, it's just going to go back to using 1433. So now if I try to connect again, it should let me right back in a 1433. Right? Pretty neat, right? I showed you networking and all kinds of cool stuff. Christina, are you getting some good info out of this since you were so worried about Linux? Maybe.
I lost my cursor for a second. Yes, I am. Thank you. I was like,
So let's look at some of the log files, right? What I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a few commands just to generate some logs. So I'm going to stop SQL Server and to confirm it's stopped. Let's run this, right? It's dead. Inactive, dead. Let's start it. Make sure it's started. It is running. Okay. Let's restart it. It's back running again. Okay. Let's clear that out. Let's go here. Oh. Okay. This is the log directory here. So here we go with all our logs, right? So you see the trace files here. And then we have our MS-SQL conf file, XDL files, all kinds of cool stuff in here, right? Error logs. All right, so let's take a look at this error sticker. Right, so these are all our error logs. Let's take a look at error log 1. Right, let's look at this one. We'll just do cat for that catalog. Error log .1. So it looks just like your log file that you see on Windows, right? Except you didn't point and click to go to it. You had to do it this way. But it gives you all the cool information that you need. Here's your service process, the main process ID. It sees that we want to use 3 gig of RAM. CPU vectorization levels detected. No idea what that means. But you know, maybe it's they're vectoring my address to come get me. So let's look at cat error log 3 or error log 3 and do more. So if you do more, it kind of lets you page up and down through it instead of just displaying it all at once. If you want to, let's say you want to check for a specific error message in your in any of your error logs, right? You can do this command. We do cat. This error, so error log dot stars or any of the error, anything that's named error log. You can do a grep for the word error, right? There we go. So it's telling me that it can't find files for the security certificates. Okay. Let's look to make sure that we're running this right. Let's try a different one. To Microsoft SQL Server, right? And there we go. Anytime SQL Server is mentioned in any of the log files, it's grabbing what it's mentioning. So if you remember in your log files, it tells you what, anytime you start your SQL Server, it tells you what version you're starting with, what the KBs are on. So these are some cool commands to use. Okay. So the last thing I'm going to show you guys are some of those monitoring things that we talked about, right? Because everybody wants to know what their servers are doing. And these are all free things, right? These aren't, you don't have to pay for any of this stuff. This stuff comes baked in with Linux, and a lot of the tools are done with it. So mpstat, oh God, that install. I'm used to using these on Azure VMs, and most of the times the packages are already installed. So my apologies, these aren't there for you. So mpstat there. This is what the processors are doing, or this is what the systems, gives you processor activity at 1 second intervals if you do it a certain way. It writes to standard output activities for each available processor, processor 0 being the first one. So if I do mpstat dash capital P and all, you can see what all 6 cores are doing, right? So that's mpstat. It's pretty neat, but not my favorite. dstat is where you can view all your system resources instantly. For an example, you can compare disk usage in combination with interrupts from your IDE controllers, or you can compare the network bandwidth numbers directly with the disk throughput in the same interval, right? So this is a live view of what's going on. You guys, the user, the idle, reads, writes, receives, send. This is the network paging system stuff. So with Linux, if you ever want this to stop scrolling, hold the Control key down and press C, and that stops it. This next tool is my favorite one, htop. Right? Htop is, again, this is your task manager for Linux. You notice up top here, we can see the processors, right? You can see all the cores. You can see the memory usage, right? So green is free, yellow is being used. Swap file is barely being touched. And then we have all our processes here, right? who's running what. Here's MSSQL up top, right? Oh, shoot. So if I wanted to, let's say I needed to stop SQL Server and not doing it in a nice way within HTOP, I can hit F9 and I could choose 5275. And I just killed SQL Server. Right? Which probably isn't nice of me, but that's what HTOP can do.
SQL killer is your new handle.
What's that?
I said SQL killer is your new handle.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, see, it's dead. So let's just start it again. See, it's alive. It's fine. Everything's fine. Okay, so that was HTOP. Again, that's the one I like the most. Again, that's one that's primarily used by a lot of non-Linux users, right? Because I can use a lot, like I use dstat and mpstat and all that. That's cool. I don't know what really I'm looking at some of the times, but HTOP kind of gives you that Windowsy feel for what's going on with your machine, right? So if I run, the last one is PIDstat. I'm sorry, I pull it. This is the last one, PIDstat. So this command is used for monitoring individual tasks currently being managed by the Linux kernel, right? So these are all the tasks currently running on my machine that are being managed by the Linux kernel, which honestly this isn't a lot. If you get on like an actual production machine, there's really not a lot going on here. I'm sorry, there is one more. I keep saying this really is the last one, folks. I'm sorry. This is a good one to use too. IOstat. IOstat gives you a live look at your disks. So you can see here what's going on. There's different ways you could do this. We do IOstat. This will keep giving me a scrolling look at my primary device, right? So yeah, that's all I got for demos, folks. Here's some free stuff for you. Like if you need to know more, these are going to be included in my slides. These are all good things to learn. All good things that if you're looking at, running Linux for your SQL servers. It takes a good bit of practice. It's a lot of fun to work with once you are working with it. Again, for a lot of folks, the big thing is it's cheaper, right? You get the total cost of ownership down because Ubuntu's free. SQL Server, you still have to pay for a SQL Server license if you're going to do like a standard or an enterprise license or whatever. You still got to pay for that license, but you don't have to pay for a Windows license on top of it. You can do clustering with SQL Server on Linux. It's done a different way. It's a little bit more of a highly advanced topic I could work with you guys on later, but clustering is available with SQL on Linux. There's all kinds of different things you can do with SQL on Linux. I like to do it quick stuff for POCs if I need to spin something up fast. I talked before about how it's used in containers. If you're not familiar with containers or if you haven't really worked with them, Docker is a good way to get yourself some exposure. Docker is free to use on Windows. You just install the Docker desktop, and they give you some cool walkthroughs to how to use it. And then if you just type in SQL Server on Docker, I believe there's a Microsoft Learn page that gives you like a free walkthrough on how to create your first SQL Server container and how to interact with it. So as tech professionals, we should all trying to be, checking out new things because eventually everything's going to be shifting, right? I remember when virtual machines came on the scene, everybody was like, "Oh, goodness, a virtual machine, who wants to run on those?" And I'm like, "I do, because I don't want to have 35 servers sitting at my desk, while I'm sitting there in shorts and a tank top because I'm getting overheated." And then again, came out with virtual machines, and that was great. And then the cloud came, and everybody's like, "Oh yeah, the cloud's a fad." The cloud wasn't a fad; it's still here, right? And now containers are huge things going on. So it was AI, but you can't run SQL Server on AI yet, as far as I know. Um, so that's what I got, folks. I hope you enjoyed the session. Um, any last questions for me?
That was awesome. Thank you. Um, so to answer Young, I saw that you joined late. We'll be putting some resources for the presentation on the meetup.com. And that goes for you too, Don. So I do have a quick question, and this is going to show my lack of knowledge in this area. But I promised I would, so here we go. Like I run into sudo commands every once in a while. It's like pulling teeth for me. Like when I have to set up a container in Docker or something. Is this kind of similar to that, or is that more like in addition, you could do that as well here too?
What, the sudo command?
Yeah, like just doing this whole setup, is that kind of similar to that concept? Or
Yes.
can you also do that stuff here in Linux with setting up those containers in Docker?
So you can definitely set up like Docker on Linux. Um, that's another package you can install. If you Oh, Chris, if you, I wish I could have showed you the installer when I first started installing it,
That's okay.
Ubuntu, because it gives you a list of packages if you want to install right out of the box, and one
Sure.
of them is Docker, and one of them is Kates for Kubernetes. So
Yeah.
the long story short, short answer to a long story. Yes, you can install containers to Linux boxes. So
Okay.
sudo
And
applies for both.
it's a lot of the same command lines, is that correct?
A lot of it is, yeah. Um, the commands are pretty similar between the two because Docker's Linux based, so they might have some commands that are you know trying to think of the right word. Cold medicine's making my brain loopy. They might have
To
some
see some.
commands that are pertinent to just Docker, right? There might be like something just
Sure,
Docker
sure.
uses.
Yeah, no,
So
that makes
you
sense.
gotta,
Proprietary to that. I just
that's it.
noticed
That
a
was the word
lot
I
of
was
the
looking
commands you were using. I was like, oh, that's what I use when I go down the rabbit hole and try to do some of this stuff.
Yeah, it's very similar. Like if you've been working with Docker, it's probably very similar to what you're going to be doing on this Linux box.
Yeah, I only do every once in a while because I do some Python stuff, and I will say that you handle it way more elegantly than me when I have to bang my head against the desk.
So
Christina,
Yeah.
if you've ever spun up just the SQL image from the SQL image itself,
Uh-huh.
basically all you got to do is put in there, yes, you accept the EULA.
Gotcha.
right,
Gotcha.
So
yeah,
if you want the easy button, it's SQL on Docker within Linux. And, you got to do a few things more than that, but it's not much
Right.
more.
Awesome. Good to know.
yeah.
Thank you.
But now some places they don't want Docker. They're going to want. I worked with clients before where they liked containers. I liked the idea, but they weren't fully ready for it yet. They wanted it full out on Linux. Amazon was one of them.
Mhm.
When I worked with Microsoft, I had to do some work with Amazon. As weird as that sounds, you had to work with a competing cloud provider because they purchased SQL Server, so they needed help, and a lot of their
Mhm.
SQL servers run on Linux. So that was kind of like my toe into the deep end. When I shouldn't say toe, it was kind of like get in there and figure it out. So I had to learn a lot of troubleshooting methods. Um, but it's the clients they didn't want to run containers. They wanted flat out Ubuntu or they wanted on Red Hat. Um, the biggest install we have, or the biggest install that I've seen it on, has always been on Ubuntu because Ubuntu's free, right?
Yeah.
Red Hat,
Yeah.
you got
Yeah.
to pay money. Ubuntu free. Docker, Docker Home free. If you want to get that paid enterprise, you got to pay for it, but it's really cool.
Nice.
Again,
Yeah.
I never thought of the day that I'd actually work with Linux on SQL Server and consider it cool, because when I was going through college, me and Linux were not friends at all. I hated it. So
I had a Mac guy
we never
trying to for the longest time trying to convince me to use it, and I was like, why? Why would I do that?
Yeah. I have friends that are system admins that are like Unix and Linux. They're like, oh yeah, this is great, blah blah blah.
Yeah,
I'm like, no. I'm like, I was a child of the 80s. We demanded a GUI. I got my
That's
GUI.
right.
I'm happy
That's
with my
right.
GUI.
Yeah,
Then
one of our
PowerShell
system-
came out.
One of our
See?
system guys the other day said, I made a joke. I was like, well, we can just do it in Linux. And he's like, yeah. And I was like, no, I was actually joking.
Yeah.
The first time I
It's
went
funny,
to
like,
Unix training, the first thing I said, oh my gosh, this is DOS.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not like, but before, if you ever like, oh, I wonder if I can do this in Linux. So like that's the way my mind shifted. Is like, oh, can I do that on Linux with this? Let me figure it out. Right. So like the high availability stuff, it's a lot of fun. Because with Windows they had Heartbeat, and on Linux that's not there. They use a whole different method. So that became fun to learn how to do that. They got some really cool tools for that. They have Stoneth, which stands for shoot the other node in the head. So
I love it.
one of the nodes are misbehaving, the master node shoots the other node in the head. And I'm like, how can I not get behind a concept like this? This is
Right.
who has not wanted to shoot their server? Like, this is amazing. So
Excellent. Well, as always, Jim, thank you so much for spending your
Thank you.
time to give us this information. And I will be posting the presentation materials when you hand them over. And thank you.
no problem. Thanks again for having me, folks. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure to have you, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
See.